Assalamu alaikum ji. I am Humair Hashmi and your instructor on organizational psychology. We are into the second lecture now. Before we go into a more deep analysis and before we take a deeper look at the subject matter of organizational psychology, thoda sa quick review of what we did in the last lecture would be in order. आपको याद है पिछले लेक्चर में हमने क्या पढ़ा था? We talked about the definition of organizational psychology, a control, prediction and understanding of human behavior in organizations. We also talked about the subject matter coming into being as a need arose. Or kya need? We had seen the world advancing very rapidly as a result of industrial revolution. The world was becoming more and more industrialized, more and more self-reliant. The world was getting into more and more organized industry. So we needed to understand how the dynamics of organizations work. इसीलिए इसकी एक्सपेंशन ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी की इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन के बाद और 20वीं सदी के शुरू में शुरू हुई है. और हमने ये भी देखा था कि उसमें उससे मुतल्लिक जो तजुर्बात किए गए विच आर कॉल्ड द हॉथॉर्न इफेक्ट, दे ब्रॉट फोर्थ many new discoveries. The discoveries, for instance, that the nature of supervision, the discovery, for instance, that the relationship of group members amongst themselves, their interest, all of these intangible factors we saw affected organizations and particularly productivity in organizations. हमने ये भी देखा था पिछली दफ़े कि हम सब्जेक्ट मैटर ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी का है वो हम और कौन सी ब्रांचेस से हमने लिया है ऑफ नॉलेज. साइकोलॉजी से तो लिया ही है हमने इसका सब्जेक्ट मैटर ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी का. What are the branches? And in that context, we saw that we borrowed it from anthropology, and then we borrowed this subject matter from sociology. We also saw that in organizational psychology, a psychologist may look at organizations from either one of the two perspectives, that is, the behavioristic or Pavlovian perspective, जबकि वो देखता है कि organization का behavior क्या है, when he is more interested in the what of behavior of the organization and the what of the nature of behavior of the people in the organization. He is not interested in this case in why are people behaving the way they are. This is, if he is only looking at from the point of view of what is the behavior and how that behavior may be controlled, then he is adopting the behavioristic or the Pavlovian approach of study of organizational behavior, organization psychology. फिर हमने ये भी देखा था कि the other approach is what is called the cognitive approach. If a psychologist, if you are interested in organizations from the point of view of why do people behave the way they do, क्या वजह है कि एक शख्स लेट आता है, क्या वजह है कि एक शख्स काम में ज्यादा दिलचस्पी लेता है, क्या वजह है कि दूसरा शख्स ज्यादा दिलचस्पी नहीं लेता, क्या वजह है कि तनख्वाह के बढ़ने से या घटने से उन पे खुशगवार या ना खुशगवार असरात पड़ते हैं. If you are looking at organization from that point of view and you are adopting the cognitive approach of study of organizational behavior, ये अभी तक हमने पिछले लेक्चर में देखा था. This was a quick review of what we had done so far. Let us go forward and take a look at the methodology of organizational psychology. ये methodology of organizational psychology क्या है? आप यकीनन methodology को पहले पढ़ के आए हैं. You have studied experimentation, you have studied experimental psychology, you have also studied research design. Psychologists जो हैं वो research कैसे करते हैं? Have you ever wondered? Well, this is what we are going to take a look at. Methodology of organizational psychology means what are the different ways, methods in which an organizational psychologist looks at organizations and the way in which the organizational psychologist collects his data. जितने भी methods हैं, I'm going to make a sweeping statement here. A sweeping statement. So listen to this carefully and see whether you agree with this or disagree with this. Psychology के जितने भी methods हैं, उनको हम दो main categories में divide कर सकते हैं. आपने यकीनन मैथडोलॉजीज पढ़ी होंगी और आप कह रहे होंगे कि बहुत से मेथड्स हैं. एक्सपेरिमेंटेशन है, इंटरव्यू है, क्वेश्चनर है, सर्वे है, पार्टिसिपेंट ऑब्जर्वेशन है, नॉन पार्टिसिपेंट ऑब्जर्वेशन है, डेथ इंटरव्यू है, और बहुत से मेथड्स हैं. लेकिन अगर हम इन मेथड्स को कैटेगराइज करने लगें तो ऑल ऑफ दीज मेथड्स कैन बी ब्रोकन डाउन into two main categories, and these are the two main categories of methods that organizational psychologists use. First of these is what is called the experimental method. अगर आपको history and systems of psychology जो मैंने पहले कोर्स पढ़ाया है आपको, अगर आप उसको रिव्यू करें तो आपको याद होगा कि फर्स्ट एक्सपेरिमेंटल लेबोरेटरी जो है ये किसने बनाई थी, कहाँ बनाई थी और क्या थी? याद आया आपको? जी हाँ, यूरोप में बनी, वुंट ने बनाई, और इसमें हमने साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स ने ये देखा था कि इंसान की नफ्सियात पे क्या क्या असरात हैं डिफरेंट स्टिमुलाइज के. और फिर वुंड के काम को बहुत से दूसरे लोगों ने आगे बढ़ाया. आपको नाम याद आया होगा एक फैचनर का या फैकनर का, जिसने साइकोफिजिकल मेथड्स हमें बताए थे. आपको नाम याद आया होगा गेस्टाल्ट स्कूल के लोगों का, जिन्होंने 5 फिनोमेना पे रिसर्च की, अपेरेंट मूवमेंट पे रिसर्च की. आपको नाम याद आया होगा वॉटसन और वॉटसन के फॉलोअर्स का, जिन्होंने रिसर्च की लर्निंग पर. आपको नाम याद आया होगा थॉर्नडाइक का, जिन्होंने बिल्लियों पे रिसर्च की. आपको नाम याद आया होगा कोहलर का, जिन्होंने बंदरों पे रिसर्च की, एक्सपेरिमेंट्स कंडक्ट किए. नाउ ऑल ऑफ दीज पीपल यूज्ड द एक्सपेरिमेंटल मेथड. नाउ बिफोर आई एक्सप्लेन दिस एक्सपेरिमेंटल मेथड टू यू, आई नीड टू एक्सप्लेन ए फ्यू टर्म्स टू यू. जो टर्म्स आपको पहले पता हैं, मैं जानता हूं कि आप पढ़ के आए हैं, आप उससे फेमिलियर होंगे, बट nevertheless, stay with me for a couple of more minutes and we will quickly explain those 2 terms, 3 terms, and then we will continue with what is experimental method and how the experimental method is used by organizational psychologists. Before you can understand what is experimental method, you need to know what is an independent variable. You obviously know what is an independent variable. You must have covered it already in experimental psychology, in research design. An independent variable is a variable that varies of its own accord. Weather is an independent variable that influences the amount of humidity in the air. The rise in temperature during the day is an independent variable. The arrival of food for Pavlov's dogs was an independent variable. The exposure to pictures, the pictures that were shown to the subjects in the experiments conducted by the Gestalt psychologists, all those pictures were independent variables. The rate of inflation in a country is an independent variable. that varies of its own accord. The amount of pay that is given in an organization to a person, to the worker, is an independent variable. The eye contact that the leader makes in an organization with his supervisors and managers is an independent variable. All of these factors are examples of independent variable. And then there is another set of variables that you are also familiar with, and that is the dependent variable. A dependent variable is the response. If you can understand an independent variable as a stimulus, then a dependent variable is the response to that stimulus. The rate of inflation in the country leading to the people's real income becoming smaller and smaller. Real incomes becoming smaller is the dependent variable. Rate of inflation is the independent variable. The heat generated in the city is the independent variable. The amount of soft drinks drunk by the people in the city as a result of heat generated is the dependent variable, the amount that is drunk. The arrival of the food for the Pavlovian dog, food is the independent variable. The dog's response of salivation is a dependent variable. The increase in salary in an organization, in a person's income, is the independent variable. And his increase in motivation as a result of that increase in his pay is the dependent variable. The sight of the mother for the baby is an independent variable. And the baby becoming restless for food is his behavior, which is called the dependent variable. The kind of leadership that is provided in an organization is an independent variable. And as a result of that kind of leadership, the changes in the organization, the more discipline in the behavior of people in the organization is a dependent variable. So an independent variable could be understood as a stimulus, and a dependent variable could be understood as a response. Experimental method is a method adopted by psychologists where they see the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable, where they can exercise control over the independent variable and see the effect of that independent variable upon the dependent variable. Taking an example of it, an organizational psychologist feels that an increase in the real pay of his employees would increase the motivation of the employees to work in the organization. What would be the independent variable in this case? The increase in pay. He can increase or decrease or make the pay constant. When he increases or decreases the pay, that pay is the independent variable, and now he wants to see the effect of that independent variable, the increase or decrease in pay, upon the motivation or behavior of the worker in the organization. The motivation or the behavior of the worker in the organization is the dependent variable. The increase or decrease in the pay is the independent variable, and the organizational psychologist is looking at the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable, the increase or decrease of pay and its effect on motivation of the worker. This is an experimental method. This is how organizational psychologists gather data. This is one of the basic methods. But it's not that simple. Because when you increase the pay of a worker, you might also meet another variable that you had not anticipated, and that may be that the worker has had an addition in his family, such that previously he had one child, now he has 2 children. अब उसके 2 बच्चे हो गए हैं. So the increase in pay which you thought was the independent variable, of whose relationship you were looking at with the dependent variable, that you expected that his motivation would rise, but his motivation did not rise because there was another variable, and that variable intervened between the relationship of the independent and the dependent variable. And what was that variable that intervened? An arrival of another family member, or somebody falling sick in his family, or he's already bought a house and he has to pay the installments for the house. This variable, increase in the family, or of somebody falling sick in the family, or his buying a house, is jeopardizing, is confusing the relationship between the independent variable, that is the raise in income, and the dependent variable, that is his motivation. And this is an example of a third kind of variable which we call the intervening variable. Intervening variables are those variables that intervene, that affect the relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. Intervening variables के आपने बहुत से नाम पहले भी सुने होंगे, और अगर आप कोई किताब पढ़ेंगे, लिटरेचर में जाएंगे ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी के, तो आपको इसके बहुत से नाम दिखाई देंगे. Intervening variable has also been called a moderating variable. Intervening variable has also been labeled confounding variable. Intervening variable has also been called antecedent variable. Intervening variables are also called by other names such as time variables. लेकिन इस लेवल पर you should not be really concerned with different names. There are justifications for those names, which are highly technical justifications. You may not be too concerned with them at the time being. For the time being, just understand the concept of the intervening variable. The concept of the intervening variable is that it intervenes between the independent variable and the dependent variable. That it affects the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. And that is a variable that affects, influences the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable is called an intervening variable. जैसे मैंने कहा, don't be confused with different labels. At this level that you are at, you should understand the concept, whatever name we may give it, but then you should understand the basic concept. And basic concept is an intervening variable, or a confounding variable, or an antecedent variable, or a moderating variable, or a time variable is one that intervenes between the relationship of the independent and the dependent variable. So experimental method is where an organizational psychologist is trying to establish a relationship between the independent and the dependent variable by controlling or taking out the effect of the intervening variable. ये बात एक मैंने और इंट्रोड्यूस कराई एक्सपेरिमेंटल मेथड में, इस पे भी गौर फरमाइए. हमने ये कहा कि एक है इंडिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल, एक है डिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल, और तीसरा वेरिएबल है जो इन दोनों के ताल्लुक पे असर रखता है, एंड दैट इज द इंटरवीनिंग वेरिएबल. When the organizational psychologists conduct research and when they use experimental methods, they try and control the effect of the intervening variable so that they can establish the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable with the effect of the intervening variable taken out. ताकि इंटरवीनिंग वेरिएबल का जो असर है इस रिलेशनशिप पर उसको हटा दिया जाए, उसको कंट्रोल कर लिया जाए. मिसाल मैं दूं आपको. हमने अभी मिसाल में आपको बताया था कि इंक्रीज इन पे मे बी एन इंडिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल एंड दिस ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट एक्सपेक्ट्स दैट बिकॉज देयर इज एन इंक्रीज इन पे the worker motivation would increase. But he notices that the worker motivation does not increase. Why? Because there is an intervening variable, an addition in the family, an accident or hospitalization, God forbid, in the family. The worker has already bought a house and he has to pay installments for that house. So his pay in increase is too small for him. And this is the intervening variable. अब थोड़ा पिछले लेक्चर में भी ध्यान कीजिए आप. हमने ये देखा था Hawthorne effect से related that in the Hawthorne studies, psychologists had seen that if they decreased the light illumination in the work area, people's productivity still did not decrease, even when the light was comparable to the moonlight. याद आया आपको? पिछले लेक्चर में हमने आपसे बताया था कि एक्सपेरिमेंट करते हुए हॉथॉर्न स्टडीज के दौरान माहिरीन नफ्सियात का, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट का ख्याल था कि अगर हम रोशनी की मिकदार वर्क एरिया में कम करेंगे तो उससे प्रोडक्शन भी कम हो जाएगी. लेकिन ऐसा नहीं हुआ. दे वांटेड टू सी द इफेक्ट ऑफ द इंडिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल विच वाज, यू आर राइट, द अमाउंट ऑफ लाइट अपॉन द डिपेंडेंट वेरिएबल विच वाज productivity, level of production. You are absolutely right. So they wanted to see the effect of illumination, independent variable, upon the dependent variable, the level of productivity. But a third intervening variable had intervened, and that was the kind of supervision that was provided to workers. Remember, the interest that the people had was another intervening variable. The interest that they had in their task. Another intervening variable, if you remember, was whether people liked each other in the group or not. Another intervening variable was the size of the group. ये सारी बातें जो थी ये intervening variables के तौर पर Hawthorne experiment में दाखिल हो गई, and they confused the relationship between illumination, amount of light, and level of productivity, dependent variable, कि कितने स्विचेस उन्होंने बनाए, कितने उन्होंने चीजें बनाई इलेक्ट्रिक कंपनी में. And this is what an experimental method is. The experimental method involves organizational psychologists looking at the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable with the effect or influence of the intervening variable or variables taken out or controlled. You have already probably covered this, and therefore I have explained it to you in very simplistic terms. अब इसके थोड़े से तरीके भी देख लेते हैं कि एक्सपेरिमेंटल मेथड में हम तरीके कौन से इख्तियार करते हैं. There is a whole series of experiments that organizational psychologists perform. But I will talk to you of only two methods that psychologists in organizational psychology very frequently use, the simple ones. वो आपके लिए सिंपल होंगे ताकि आप इस लेवल पर उनको समझ सकें. ये जैसे जैसे आप आगे चलते चले जाएंगे, experimental methods will become more and more complicated, more and more designed oriented, more and more economical. लेकिन फिलहाल ये दो तरीके मैं आपको समझाने की कोशिश करता हूं that organizational psychologists use. The first is what is called the control versus the experimental group method. Organizational psychologists use experimental method as one of the main data collection efforts, and in that context they use what is called the control versus the experimental group method. फर्ज कीजिए कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट ये देखना चाह रहा है कि अगर वो किसी शख्स की तनख्वाह 10% बढ़ा दे तो क्या उसकी कारकर्दगी पे खुशगवार असर पड़ेगा या नहीं. Using the control versus experimental group method, what organizational psychologists do is that they get hold of a group of people in the organization, select a group of people in the organization on a random basis. We'll explain to you also what is random, but for the time being just understand that they select a group of people in the organization and select another group of people from the same organization randomly in the same manner that they have selected the first group. Let us call the first group Group A, and let us call the second group Group B. They raise the income of Group A and do not raise the income of Group B. Let them work at the same level. The Group A, where income has been raised, is called the experimental group, and the Group B, where the income has not been raised, is called the control group. अब एक्सपेक्टेशन क्या है ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट की? एक्सपेक्टेशन ये है दैट दोज पीपल who have experienced, who have received a raise in their income, their productivity would also rise. So they compare the productivity of Group A, which is the experimental group, with Group B, which is the control group. Group A has received an increase in income. Group B, the control group, has not received an increase in income. If there is an increase in the productivity of Group A as compared to Group B, then they can say, the experimental psychologists or organizational psychologists can say that a raise in income leads to a raise in motivation or productivity of the people in an organization. They have used the independent variable on Group A and have not used the independent variable on Group B. The Group A, where independent variable has been varied, is called the experimental group, upon which the experiment is conducted, and Group B, which has not received the independent variable, is called the control group, which allows the baseline data so that data could be compared with the data from the experimental group. And this is simply control versus experimental group design. इसका organizational psychology का एक experimental method का एक simple तरीका है. एक और तरीका जो दूसरा मैं बताने लगा था आपको of experimentation in organizational psychology is called the repeated measures design. In a repeated measures design, single group or a single person may be used. Instead of using two groups, the control and the experimental group, the organizational psychologist uses just one group. For instance, he may give a rise of 10% pay to the workers in an organization randomly selected. Let us say he selects 10 workers and increases their pay by 10%, and then what would be that if he increases the pay of the workers to see how that affects their behavior? What would be that called? Would that be an independent variable? Yes, increase in pay would be the independent variable. So he increases the pay by 10% and then see how people increase their productivity. And then he might raise the pay to 20% and then see how that 20% influences the productivity of the workers. He might increase the pay to, let us say, 50%, and then see how the increase from 10 to 20 to 50% has influenced the output or the productivity of the workers. If and when the organizational psychologist repeatedly uses the same group or the same people for exposure to the independent variable, that is called a repeated measures design. There are many methods in experimental psychology, in organizational psychology, that involves experimentation. I have explained to you the two simple ones: the control versus the experimental group method, and the repeated measures design. Ye, in simplistic terms, is the experimental method that is used by organizational psychologists. Simplistic terms इसलिए मैं गुजारिश कर रहा हूं क्योंकि इसकी बहुत वेरिएशंस हैं. Control versus experimental group, एक की बजाय we could have 2 controls, 2 experimental, 3 controls, 3 experimentals. And in a repeated measures design, you have many variations also. इसलिए फिलहाल आपको यही समझना काफी है, आपकी सतह पर, आपकी स्टेज पर, that organizational psychologists use experimental method as one of the main tools of collecting data, and that within the experimental method, these are the 2 main strategies. ये 2 main रास्ते हैं experimentation के that organizational psychologists use: the control versus the experimental methods and the repeated measures design. चलिए अब इससे आगे चलते हैं. मैंने कहा था कि अगर हम ये इन सब मेथड्स को एक नज़र से देखें तो we can divide all the methods that organizational psychologists use into 2 categories. One category, I said, was experimental methods, and the other category is what is called the observational method. In observational method, the researcher has no control, cannot affect, cannot change the independent variable. He has no control over the independent variable. He cannot control. For instance, if an experimental psychologist or the organizational psychologist wanted to see what would be the effect of, God forbid, the death in the family of a worker upon the productivity of the worker. In this case, what is the independent variable? A tragedy in the family. Now, he has no control over tragedy in the family of a worker. He cannot lead to or bring about a tragedy in the family of a worker. So he has to wait and he has to see if a tragedy strikes, God forbid, a worker in the organization, then what effect does it have on the behavior or the motivation of the worker. If he wants to see what is the effect of a disease on the worker's morale, or on the worker's motivation, or on the worker's productivity, he cannot create that disease in the organization and in the worker. All that he can do is that when somebody is sick, when somebody has contracted a disease, then he can see the effect that that disease is having upon the morale or the motivation or the productivity of the worker. In this case, what is he doing? He is not conducting an experiment, he is observing. And this is the other method of collecting data that is used by organizational psychologists. Observation. We normally, in organizational psychology, we normally talk about two kinds of observational methods. As I said, in experimentation there are dozens of methodologies. Similarly, in observational methods there are many methodologies, but I will talk about the more close ones, the two of them, the major ones called observational methods. One is what's called the case design method. When the organizational psychologist is studying the organization as a single unit. If you wanted to see, for instance, what is the average production of X textile mill, Y textile mill, or Z textile mill, he would be focusing on X textile mill. वो सिर्फ X textile mill को ही पढ़ रहे हैं और उसी में ही देख रहे हैं. क्या मशीनों की वजह से प्रोडक्टिविटी इनकी इतनी है? क्या लोगों की तनख्वाहों की वजह से प्रोडक्टिविटी है? क्या लोगों के बाहमी ताल्लुकात की वजह से प्रोडक्टिविटी है? In any case, the focus of attention, of observation of the organizational psychologist is one single organization. He may adopt many methods within this observation. He may adopt interviews, he may adopt questionnaires, he may adopt other observational techniques such as rating scales, but his focus of attention is a single unit, and that is why in organizational psychology we call it case design method of observation. इसके अलावा एक और जो दूसरा तरीका है, that is called the survey design method. A survey design method opposed to a case design method is when an organizational psychologist is observing more than one organizations or more than one cases in an organization. For instance, the organizational psychologist is interested in looking at what is the productivity level of X textile mill, Y textile mill, and Q textile mill. In this case, there are three organizations that he is interested in. He wants to make across comparisons. He wants to see what is it in organization X that results in, let us say, 100 yards of productivity per unit, whereas in Y textile mill, the productivity per unit is 150 yards, whereas in Q textile mill, the productivity is 130 yards. Why is this difference? If the organizational psychologist is focusing on more than one unit, more than one organizations, then he is using what is called in organizational psychology the survey design methodology of observation. He may adopt within the case design or the survey design methodologies, he may adopt what is called the longitudinal method. आप इससे भी वाकिफ होंगे, आप ये पढ़ के आए होंगे पहले भी. The longitudinal method involves study of an organization or the study of many organizations or the study of a phenomena in an organization or the study of many phenomena in the organization over a longer time period. If an organizational psychologist wants to see how the productivity of an organization is affected as a result of change of weather, then that would be an example of a longitudinal study. he would be looking at the organization in the summer, the spring, the fall, the winter. Time period is extended. When a time period is extended, we call it the longitudinal method of observational studies. Or he may adopt what is called the cross-sectional method. Cross-sectional method is when the organizational psychologist is interested in looking at the development but is not waiting for a longer time period. If he wants to see, for instance, how organizations change over, let us say, a period of 10 years, then he could use a single case design method, and the longitudinal method, he would select one organization and study it for 10 years. Or he could use the survey design method and the cross-sectional method of research or observation, where he would choose more than one organization. He would choose an organization which has existed for 1 year, an organization which has existed for 2 years, an organization that existed for 3 years, another organization that has existed for 4 years, so 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 years. And he would study all those organizations and see how time from 1 to 2 years, to 3 years, to 4 years, to 5 years, to 6 years, to 7 years, to 8 years, to 9 years, to 10 years influences the development of organizations. He is not waiting for 10 years. He is studying organizations across a broad board using the survey design methodology. If it's methodology, it's called the cross-sectional methodology of observation. So we have a combination of a case survey and a survey design methodology. And within the case, we have the longitudinal method, and within the survey, we may have the cross-sectional method. And this is how organizational psychologists study organizations using observational methods. एक दो बातें इससे मुतल्लिक और भी मैं आपसे गुजारिश करना चाहूँगा. इससे मुतल्लिक पहली बात तो ये है that there are certain factors, at least 3 or 4 of them, that affect the observational methodology. As in case of experimental methods, the intervening variable influence the independent and the dependent variable. In the similar manner, there are factors that influence observational methodologies. What are those factors? Researcher's attitude. If the researcher has a biased attitude, if the researcher is already looking for something that he wants to prove or he wants to disprove, then that would be a biased attitude. It will be not a seeking attitude, but a testing attitude. And that might jeopardize, that might put in danger his observation. अगर एक organizational psychologist पहले ही ये बावर किए हुए हो कि तनख्वाह के बढ़ाए जाने से वर्कर का मोटिवेशन जो है वो नहीं बढ़ेगा, तो this attitude, this opinion, this bias, this prejudice of the experimenter would affect his observation. Another is the intensity of the observer. Is he looking at, is he obtaining all types of information, particularly information that does not coincide with his opinion? आपको याद है जब हम हिस्ट्री एंड सिस्टम पढ़ रहे थे तो हमने आपसे जिक्र किया था डार्विनियन पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू का, और हमने आपको बताया था कि चार्ल्स डार्विन जो है वो जब अपनी रिसर्च के लिए निकले थे दुनिया के मुख्तलिफ तख्तों में गए, जाके मुख्तलिफ रीजन्स में गए और उन्होंने डेटा इकट्ठा किया अपनी थियोरी के लिए, तो वो उस चीज़ का ख़ास ख्याल रखते थे जो चीज या जो एविडेंस या जो सबूत उनकी थियरी के खिलाफ था. बिकॉज इफ द रिसर्चर इज not obtaining all the information but only information that supports his point of view, then that would make his observation biased. Another point that needs to be clarified in this context is the integrative ability of the worker, of the observer. Can he integrate all the information that he's collected? Can he see it as a whole? Can he see that these various elements that he has collected are related, connected to each other? All of these factors, that is his attitude, that is his bias, that is his ability to obtain all information, and his integrative ability influence, affect the observational method as a whole, and may bring in a bias in the observational methodology that is adopted by the organizational psychologists. अब इससे आगे थोड़ा सा चलते हैं, and that is the various technologies that are used for observation. For instance, a questionnaire. आपने भी इस्तेमाल किया होगा, आपने सुना भी होगा. For instance, a rating scale. For instance, a interview schedule. These are all tools of observation. The tools of observations need to be in a certain manner. That is, the tools of observation first must be reliable. When we are talking about observational methodology in organizational psychology, the first thing that we have to keep in mind relating to this methodology, observational methodology, is whether the tools that we are using, are they reliable? ये reliable tools क्या होते हैं? फर्ज कीजिए कि मैं एक वेइंग मशीन लेता हूं और उस पे मैं आपका वेट करता हूं, और उस वेइंग मशीन पे आपका वेट है, पीर वाले दिन आपका वेट आता है 122 पाउंड. मैं बुध वाले दिन आपका उसी मशीन पे आप ही का वेट करता हूं और उस पे उसका आपका वेट आता है 412 पाउंड, और फिर मैं आप जुमे वाले दिन उसी मशीन पे आपका वेट खुद ही करता हूं और उस पे आपका वेट आता है 17 पाउंड, मिसाल के तौर पर. क्या ख्याल है आपका? इज दैट वेइंग मशीन ए रिलायबल इंस्ट्रूमेंट? ऑफ कोर्स नॉट, बिकॉज यू नो that there could not be so many variations in the weight. So, whatever methodology, whatever tool that is being used by the researcher in observation must be a reliable tool. That is, it must weigh, it must yield consistent score. अगर आज आपका वेट एक मशीन पे 122 पाउंड है, तो 2 दिन बाद भी 122 या 123 या 120 होना चाहिए, और 4 दिन बाद भी 122, 123 या 120 होना चाहिए. इतनी ज्यादा वेरिएशन उसमें नहीं आनी चाहिए. और यही चीज हम क्वेश्चनेयर या रेटिंग स्केल या इंटरव्यू शेड्यूल से मुतल्लिक कहते हैं, दैट इट मस्ट बी रिलायबल, दैट इट मस्ट यील्ड कंसिस्टेंट स्कोर्स. दूसरा कॉन्सेप्ट जो इससे रिलेटेड है, दैट इज द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ वैलिडिटी. इन ऑब्जर्वेशन मेथड, द टूल्स दैट यू यूज, द टूल दैट ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स यूज must be, should be, are valid. What is meant by valid? Validity. The concept of validity refers to the ability of a tool to measure what it is supposed to measure. मिसाल के तौर पर, अगर आपने मोटिवेशन को चेक करने के लिए कोई पैमाना बनाया है, तो वो आपके वर्कर की मोटिवेशन चेक करे, आपके वर्कर की लॉयल्टी ना चेक करे. अगर आपने पैमाना बनाया है कि आप वर्कर की प्रोडक्टिविटी चेक करना चाहते हैं, तो वो टूल जो आपका है वो वर्कर की प्रोडक्टिविटी ही चेक करे, उसकी मोटिवेशन चेक ना करे. एंड दैट इज व्हाट इज मेंट by the term validity. If you have a weighing machine, then the weighing machine must tell you the weight of the person and not the height of the person. ये आप इतनी सिंपल बात इस वक्त क्योंकि मैं एक्सप्लेन ऐसे कर रहा हूं, आपको लग रही है कि हाँ बिल्कुल सीधी सी बात है, बट when we develop observational technologies in observational methodologies in the broad realm of organizational psychology, we have to keep in mind that the technology that we developed is valid, that it measures what it is supposed to measure. So we have talked about two concepts related to observational methodology, the concept of reliability and the concept of validity. As we go along, we'll be talking more and more about reliability and validity, and we'll be talking more and more about experimental methodology. But for the time being, we will end today's discussion here by recapturing what we have discovered so far. We have seen that organizational psychologists use mainly two broad categories of methodologies. One that is experimental methods, and the other which are called the observational methods. In experimental methods, you have the independent and the dependent variable, and you see the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable with the effect of the intervening variables taken out. I gave you the examples of the independent and the dependent variables. Pay increase is an independent variable, productivity is a dependent variable, accident in the family, inflation in the country might be the intervening variable. And that is what you want to see. You want to establish the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable with the effect of the intervening variable taken out. That is one measure, that is one methodology that organizational psychologists use. The other methodology that organizational psychologists use is what has been called observational methods. Observational methods include the case design and the survey design, where the presenter has no control over the independent variable. He might look at a single case, or he might look at a number of cases and make cross comparisons. Simply speaking, these are the two basic methodologies that are used by organizational psychologists. We will talk more and more about these as we progress in this course. I hope I have been able to make some sense to you, and I hope you would read the book and take a look at the notes again and again. Until next time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.